Hello, this is Unsung with GameLeap, and in today's video we're going to be going over the full patch 13.22 preview. The two very big highlights of this patch are going to be changes to Mage's attack speed in general, as well as a revert of Janna. The current Janna is 500 auto attack range and likes to throw her Q out, which is kind of uninteractive. We're reverting back to a previous Janna that is more focused on getting her W off and auto attacking during the lane phase. We'll go a little bit more into these changes and why exactly Riot is reverting Janna later on in the video. That being said, let's go ahead and talk about the first big change here. There is a huge discrepancy between low elo and high elo mid mates. More skilled mid players tend to take the attack speed shard purely for wave state. Wave state is massively important for every mid lane mage once we hit a certain skill bracket. Essentially, even the hardest scaling mids are going to need to rotate towards their jungler by getting priority in their lane in the early game. The easiest way to do this is by simply using your abilities, but of course this consumes a large portion of your mana in the early game where mana is the most important. This has resulted in a lot of mage champions actually going for the attack speed shard instead of the traditional adaptive. This has become such a problem in higher MMR brackets that it's essentially a requirement to take the attack speed shard on most mages. To summarize Riot Frogson's Twitter post, it is a good thing that mage players want to take the attack speed shard. It's great that they want to harass and actually push their lane to interact with their opponents, but it shouldn't be a mandatory thing. It instead indicates that most mage auto attacks are slow and tedious to use, which is of course pretty true. It doesn't take a genius to realize that something like Vex's auto attack is a lot more responsive than something like Vladimir's. For these reasons, Riot is going to be buffing both the attack speed and the missile speed of the majority of the mage roster. The only exceptions to these changes are going to be champions that have a auto attack replacement, such as Cassio, Victor, Vlad, and the like. Essentially, if your champion has an auto attack replacement, they will not be receiving this update, and if they don't have an auto attack replacement, then they will be receiving this update. Riot fully expects a couple of champions to come out overtuned due to these changes, and they'll be nerfing them accordingly. Here is the full list for timing: Rumble, Singed, Heimer, Ziggs, Xerath, Ivern, Nico, Ahri, Twisted Fate, and Teemo. Now for missile speed: Karthus, Cassiopeia, Annie, Viger, Teemo, Orianna. And then finally attack speed: Singed, Heimer, Annie, Vel'Koz, Xerath, Liss, Zillion, Anivia, Zoe, Ryze, Syndra, Talia, Ahri, and LeBlanc. This seems like a relatively small and inconsequential change, but I promise you that this is going to have a gigantic impact on the mid lane meta. Orianna, for example, is already a very strong champion on 13.21. She has good matchups, her harass and lane using mana is very high, and it's also quite difficult to play a melee champion into her. Something as small as a missile speed buff will only make her matchup spread even better. Melees, for example, could have a significantly harder time into Orianna because they're going to be the victim of these auto attacks more often than not. So the TLDR is that if you're a mage player, your lane phase is going to be significantly easier. You're not going to have to fight with your auto attacks as much to CS under tower, and it's going to be easier to harass lower range champions. Just a reminder, head on over to GameLeap.com if you want to learn tips and tricks for any of the champions listed in this video. Now, before we get into the balance, let's go ahead and talk about the second big change of this patch, and that has to be the Janna revert. Like we talked about a little bit before, Janna is largely uninteractive. She doesn't harass during the lane phase like she used to. She's very squishy, and her auto attack range makes it difficult to actually punish a lot of the melee champions that she does well into. Her win rate has remained quite high throughout the entire duration of her rework, and it's kind of put her in a spot of being a balanced outlier. Riot can't really nerf Janna because she doesn't feel fun to play, and they can't buff her because she's simply too strong. This leaves them with reverting as the only true option. Not only will she be more fun for the average player, but she'll also be significantly easier to balance and get the buffs that she needs and the nerfs that she needs as well. Let's go ahead and talk about all the changes now. Her attack range is going from 500 to 550. Her attack timing is going a little bit slower. They're changing the majority for other base stats. She's receiving a new passive that's allowing her to convert her bonus movement speed into on-hit damage on her W and auto attack. But her old passive is being removed. Our Q mana cost is going up. The cooldown is also going up by 2 seconds. It does more damage at later ranks, but it's going to be weaker early on. The scaling is also going up by a massive 15%. Janna's W is receiving a massive buff to the cooldown. It is going from 12 seconds to 8 seconds. The damage on her W is going slightly down in the early game, but then of course Janna is receiving that bonus magic damage on hit. What's really nice is that the W passive no longer deactivates while it's on cooldown, and the slow duration is being shortened as well. Janna's E cooldown is also going to start going down whenever we hit an opponent with Q, W, and R by 20%. This is quite nice because the base shielding value on the E is going up significantly, and the cooldown is going from 9 seconds at max rank to 12 seconds. But this is overall a net buff simply due to the fact that we're able to reduce the cooldown with the Q, W, and R. The shield also no longer decays and instead lasts a static 4-second duration and has a lower mana cost. These Janna changes are going to be straight up buffs. This is going to make her a little bit more interactive in lane, more pleasant to play, and also clutch where she needs to be clutch. Janna is known for her amazing peel, and these changes only reward her more for playing the champion skillfully instead of sitting back and trying to snipe people constantly with Qs. This iteration of Janna has been around for years. It's not really a guess of whether or not it's going to be strong. It is 1000% going to be strong, and if you're a good Janna player, it will show. Personally, I prefer this variation of Janna more so than the Q spam one that we have currently. Q spam Janna relies on your opponents having a predictable pattern in order to get the most effectiveness out of her kit. Now I can actually walk up, harass people, and then play like a true enchanter instead of sitting in a bush and waiting to get that 300 damage random nuke. Those are the two big ones of the patch. Let's go ahead and jump into the nitty-gritty of the rest of the balance changes. Seraphine, like Janna, is receiving some significant work. Last patch she got a small rework that has tried to push her out of AP carry and into mid lane and support a little bit more often. This, however, was a failure, and Seraphine APC has shot up drastically in win rate over the course of the patch. In order to fix this, Riot is trying to shift Seraphine more towards support again. Her base movement speed is going from 325 to 335. This by itself is a massive buff to support Seraphine and to mid lane Seraph. AP carry Seraphine doesn't run around the map as often, so while this is a decent change for her, it's also going to be more beneficial to mid and support. The E's base damage is also receiving a nice buff per rank. Now to balance this out without making her too strong, they're nerfing Seraphine's passive slightly, they're changing the Q damage and threshold from 75% of missing HP to 85% of missing HP. They're also hitting the W's shield AP ratio very slightly. Overall, I do think that these are mostly positive changes. Of course, the movement speed buff is going to be pretty massive in the hands of skilled players, but Riot has hit the nail on the head for the majority of these changes in my opinion. Now let's go ahead and talk about the buff list, which is going to be quite small this patch, aside from the mage basic attack changes of course. Rammus is receiving 10 more bonus armor on his W, and they're not going to hit the total armor scaling. Unfortunately, the nerfs to Rammus last patch made him drop a massive 5% win rate, going from the best #1 jungler in the game to straight up disappearing overnight. The nerfs to Dr. Mundo are also being walked back on. Instead of his E's current ratio being 2 to 3% of his max HP, it's going from 2 to 3.4% of his max HP. This will of course bring Mundo's damage up a little bit more, but like Rammus, his champion was severely overnerfed in the last patch. The meta top lane is in a decent spot to counter Mundo already. I'm not sure if he's going to rise to being an A tier champion again, but with his current performance, he's going to be sitting in C tier for a little bit longer in my opinion. Now that we covered the small amount of buffs on this patch, let's go ahead and cover the nerfs. These are really important. The majority of these nerfs are targeted towards AD junglers that are overperforming, as well as some of these scaling champions that are really eating good on this patch. Briar is going to be #1 on this nerf list, and she's receiving some actual meaningful number changes for once. This champion has been an absolute monster since her release, and she has been dominating in essentially every single elo bracket. She is the highest win rate or second highest win rate AD jungler in the game on essentially every single patch. She has the option to go lethality and straight up assassinate people, or she could also go gore drinker into bruiser and be an absolute drain tank. Every single nerf that Briar has received has been really minor in comparison to her strength overall, but this time around it is not the case. Briar's Q is eating a minor base damage nerf at max rank, but this is not meaningful by itself. What is meaningful here is the Q armor shred reduction is being nerfed from 26% to 20%. 6% armor reduction is a pretty big deal because Briar has to deal damage in order to heal herself. A percentage armor reduction is also equally as effective against a squishy as it is against a tank. This is overall just a net nerf to her. The big nerf to this champion, however, is going to be on her R. Briar's R is losing 50 base damage and also receiving a massive change to the AD scaling. Currently, the damage goes 150, 325 to 500. After the nerf, it's going to be 150, 300, and then 450 at max rank. The bonus AD ratio, however, is going from 110% to 75% of Briar's bonus AD. This is a pretty big nerf to Briar's damage overall, as she does rely on her ulti to get into skirmishes in the mid and late game. I imagine that this champion's win rate will not drop that drastically, and she'll probably end up needing another round of tuning, but this is a pretty decent start. Now that we talked about the nerfs the #1 AD jungler is going to be receiving, let's go ahead and talk about #2. Graves has been completely overpowered since the pet changes, and of course, since they brought up the bonus AD ratio on the pets, he has gotten even stronger. In order to combat Graves' current strength, Riot is reducing the amount of bonus armor that he receives from his E. At rank 1, Graves currently gains 4 bonus armor, and then at rank 5, he gains 16. After the changes, it's going from 2 to 14. This will significantly slow down Graves' clear in the early game and bring him more in line with other junglers. Currently on patch 13.21, Graves has a very fast clear, he's incredibly tanky in the jungle, and his scaling is immense due to his itemization. Hopefully a change like this is going to be minor enough to where Graves is still going to be a decent pick, but he's not going to be pick or ban in every single lobby. I don't know about you guys, but I'm seeing a lot of Graves in my games. Kassadin is next up on the chopping block. This champion is receiving a minor nerf to his E, a 5% reduction on the AP ratio. The R, however, is receiving a 10% AP ratio reduction. This is a pretty hefty nerf overall. Kassadin's R was accidentally buffed a couple of patches ago, and that's what's led to his spike in win rate. This nerf will 100% affect his damage substantially especially in the mid to late game, and actually give you a chance to fight back before he hits his scaling wall now. When Kassadin, the weak early game champion, has over a 52% win rate, you know that something is wrong. It's nice to see him not be overnerfed and receiving a straight up gutting. Neela is also going to be a champion slated for nerfs in patch 13.22. Currently, this champion is on the sleeper overpowered side. She has really good matchups, she has good pairing with the majority of the meta supports, and she can't be punished accordingly enough in the early game. To try and fix this, Neela's Q bonus attack speed is losing 10% at the max level. This is overall a pretty minor nerf and won't affect Neela's damage too much. The R damage over time ratio is going from 112% of Neela's bonus AD to only 80% of her bonus AD. This, however, will affect her damage very much. These changes overall will make Neela a little bit less oppressive in the mid to late game, but she's still going to be a scaling monster if she's allowed to get her items. If you're a Neela main, I don't think that you have much to worry about. Senna is going to be the next champion on the nerf list. The damage on Senna's Q is going down by 20 points at max rank, with the bonus AD ratio remaining unchanged. The same exact nerf is also being applied to her Q's healing. They're only reducing the heal by 20 points at max rank, but the ratio will remain unchanged. This is a way smaller nerf than what was anticipated, and Senna is 100% going to remain playable after these nerfs. Tahm Kench is also receiving a nerf. They overbuffed him on the previous patch and turned him into a mid-game monster. The nerf here is walking back on that buff slightly, but Tahm Kench is going to remain a decent top laner. Riot's goals with the Tahm Kench changes are to make him more of a top laner instead of a support because people simply enjoy him more top lane. He'll probably need a little bit more work, but hopefully this gets him a little bit closer to balance instead of being the absolute meat wall that he is right now. And finally, last but not least on our nerf list is going to be Ziggs. They're nerfing Ziggs base armor from 22 to 18. This seems pretty significant at first, but Ziggs has such a long range, he's not really going to be taking physical damage too often. In the mid lane, he's able to stay out of range of the majority of AD assassins, Zed being the one real exception, so he'll still be an okay pick there, but bot lane Ziggs is going to be significantly weaker in the early game. If we're able to get an all-in out to him, it's way more likely that we'll be able to straight up kill him, instead of only getting him low and then forcing his teleport back. Teleport removes a lot of Ziggs' weaknesses. This change will, however, amplify them. And with that, we're going to conclude this video. This was Unsung with Gamely. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. I'll see you in the next one.